Good evening, welcome back to World Talks, coming to you live from Warsaw. I'm Salia Stremska. Following the Hungarian elections earlier this month, which saw Peter Magyar and his TISA party oust Viktor Orbán after 16 years in power, a series of significant changes has been put in motion. These include a shift in Hungary's stance towards the European Union, a number of upcoming domestic reforms, and renewed momentum on unlocking funds for Ukraine. To discuss, I am joined by Zsolt Darvas, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. Good evening, sir. Delighted to have you with us.
Good evening.
So let's start with Hungary and Slovakia dropping their vetoes, which cleared the way for EU's 20th sanctions package against Russia. It really feels like the final collapse of Viktor Orbán's pro-Russian foreign policy. How significant is this latest package in practice? I mean, are these sanctions still having a real impact on Russia's ability to wage the war?
The new sanction package includes hundreds of measures against companies who are related to Russia's military efforts. It includes measures for trade, it includes financial measures, energy measures, various measures to enforce earlier sanctions. For example, there is a sanction on a port in Indonesia because that port allowed the Russian shadow fleet to deliver sanctioned Russian oil. So these hundreds of measures, all of them are obviously small steps, but I think they are important and they are not just symbolic. So they make Russia more difficult to wage the war. And more generally on the impact of sanctions, I saw lots of research suggesting that official Russian data are likely false. So the Russian Statistical Office reports much nicer data. There are some estimates, for example, that inflation was much higher than what was reported, which means that real economic activity of Russia has been much weaker than it's officially shown. So I do think that sanctions work. They take a long time, they gradually weaken the Russian economy, but in my view, the sanctions are useful and weaken Russia's ability to fight the war.
Now, another positive development, the much-awaited 90 billion euros loan for Ukraine was finally unlocked. Having said that, according to Kyiv Post, while Ukraine's budget will be fully financed this year in light of the loan, a gap remains in defense funding. So, looking ahead to further support for Ukraine, is Hungary likely to take part finally now that Orbán won't be there?
It's very difficult to say. Peter Magyar and his government, which is to be formed in the coming weeks, have not yet made any clear declarations on whether they would in the future support Ukraine. So far, they said that the deal which Mr. Orbán bargained, namely that Hungary, but also Slovakia and Czech Republic, will not take any risk of the current 90 billion loan. Peter Magyar said that he would keep this agreement. Whether they will be more open, I do hope so, because the new government emphasized that, first of all, they want to be a constructive European partner. They also recognized that Ukraine is suffering from an illegal war and Russia's war against Ukraine should be stopped by any means. So it needs to be seen how the new government will act, but at this stage they have not made any clear commitment on that.
And speaking of funds, Hungary is also seeking to unlock money for itself from the European Union. Nearly 18 billion euros in EU funds remain frozen over the rule of law and corruption concerns. And there is an August deadline to reach an agreement on spending or risk losing the funds altogether. Now, Magyar says he will begin negotiations in mid-May. How do you assess his chances of success on this front?
So let me first start by saying that there was already a European Commission delegation in visiting Budapest after the election, the week after the election. So negotiations or discussions at least have already started between representatives of the new government and the European Commission. Now, in my view, this August deadline could be met. I mean, first of all, the government should put in place very urgently the badly needed measures for controlling corruption and improving the rule of law situation. Péter Magyar made it very clear that Hungary will join the European Public Prosecutor's Office, which I think in itself would be a major step for the protection of the European Union financial interest. Now, what is clearly not feasible is to implement all the milestones and targets in Hungary's recovery and resilience plans, which has been approved by the Council 4 or 5 years ago, but also for Poland, but also for some other countries like Portugal and Greece. A very special solution was found to accelerate the disbursement of the fund, namely that these countries created a new instrument within the National Development Bank in each country, and changed the recovery plan to set the milestone as setting up this fund and providing financing to that fund. And this can be done before August for sure. And then this fund within the National Development Bank could actually finance the various investment measures in later, including in next year. So I think that, again, it's a very tight deadline, but it should be feasible if the government acts quickly on addressing rule of law and corruption concerns.
So let's zoom in on Péter Magyar's incoming cabinet. So he has already announced several names, including former executives from Vodafone and Shell, and has said that he intends to break up the so-called super ministries. So do you think this strategy, focusing on technocrats with limited political experience, will actually pay off?
In my view, having experts in a government is always preferable to have full-time politicians who never worked, in real life, never experienced how a company is actually working. What does it mean to face regulation when you're a company and have to do investment or business or sign a contract? So in my view, having experts and technocrats is much more preferable. And this also offers, in my view, a better chance of designing policies which are indeed, supported by the concrete discipline, for economics, the economics disciplines, for foreign affairs, obviously the foreign affairs issues, rather than having highly political people in the government. So I think there is a good chance that the new government will have a good program.
On foreign policy, I have a quote for Péter Magyar, who says, "I would like to strengthen the relationship between Hungary and Austria for historical as well as cultural and economic reasons." So reviving old regional ties, is it about wielding more influence in Brussels by forming a bloc? What could this strategy look like in practice, beyond rhetoric?
Some years ago, the so-called Visegrad 4 countries, including Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, formed a rather close alliance and, tried to work together to support their interest in European discussions. Now, unfortunately, this formation broke down, largely due to the positions of the previous Hungarian governments. In my view, including Austria is a very natural step, partly because of Austria's geographical closeness, but also Austria is one of the biggest investors in Central European countries. So in my view, the interest of these 4 Visegrad countries and Austria can be aligned well. And, if they join forces, they can probably, better achieve certain issues and progress in policies which are important for the Central European region.
Now, Hungary also wants to join the Eurozone by 2030 at the latest. So that's pretty much in 3.5 years, right? So is it doable, and what could the consequences be here?
So first, let me clarify. The new government aims to achieve the conditions needed for Eurozone entry by 2030, but they have not yet set a date of actual entry. In my view, the only crucial issue is the fiscal position, because so far, in the first 3 months of this year, the budget deficit was really enormous. The previous government paid out massive amounts to try to support its chances for re-election. And the new government will have to make a very significant fiscal adjustment. Now, we can talk about how realistic it is, but first on the euro prospect. So if the government can indeed control the budget deficit and put it on a steadily declining path and reach below 3% value, let's say in 3 years from now, then that would also put the public debt on a downward trajectory. So these fiscal conditions of euro entry would be met. The interest rate, which is another condition for entering the Eurozone, behaves in a so-called endogenous, as economists would say. But if explaining in plain language, if people expect that Hungary would join the Eurozone, and this is credible, then the borrowing cost of the country would go down. This has also happened in other countries before the euro entry. So again, that's not a very demanding issue. Inflation can also be an issue. Nevertheless, what we have seen in the past couple of days since the government has been elected, that the currency, or the exchange rate of the Hungarian currency, appreciated very significantly. This will put a downward pressure on inflation. And again, in the next 2-3 years, the new government should be able to form inflation-reducing policies. So again, I think that also could be met. Another condition is being a stable exchange rate in the so-called exchange rate mechanism of the European Union. That would require maintaining a plus minus 15% fluctuations of the domestic currency. Again, not a big issue. And finally, there are also some legal issues. The central bank law should be fully harmonized with the European Union legislation. This is not yet the case, but this issue can be solved within weeks. So overall, just to summarize, if the government would be able to control the fiscal situation, reduce the budget deficit, put it on track, then in my view, it is indeed realistic that the conditions for euro entry will be reached by 2030.
And on this positive note, we have to conclude. Zsolt Darvas, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TVP World.